In 1982, the video game industry generated $3.2 billion in revenue. 2 years later, it generated $100 million, a 97% collapse. In 24 months, retailers stopped stocking games entirely. Industry analysts declared video games a dead fad, no different from pet rocks or CB radios. The medium that would eventually become the largest entertainment industry on Earth came within years of being abandoned permanently. This is what actually happened, and why almost everything you've heard about it is only part of the story. To understand the crash, you have to understand what the boom actually looked like, because the industry didn't fall from a modest height, it fell from an extraordinary one. The Atari 2600, launched in September 1977 at $189.95, was the first mass-market home video game console to use interchangeable ROM cartridges. Before the 2600, home gaming meant dedicated systems that played only the games built into the hardware. The cartridge format changed the economic model permanently. Buy the console once, buy games repeatedly. By 1980, the Atari 2600 was the best-selling Christmas gift in America. Atari's parent company, Warner Communications, reported that Atari represented approximately 31% of Warner's total revenue by 1982. Atari alone was generating approximately $2 billion annually at its peak. The arcade market was growing simultaneously. The number of arcades in the United States doubled from approximately 5,000 in 1980 to 10,000 by 1982. Pac-Man, licensed from Namco and released in North American arcades in 1980, became the highest grossing arcade game in history, generating approximately $2.4 billion in quarters during its commercial run. In 1982, home console units peaked at 11.5 million sold in a single year. The industry employed tens of thousands of people. New development studios were forming monthly. Publishers who had never made a game in their lives were entering the market because the returns seemed limitless. The 2600 success created a specific economic structure that contained its own destruction mechanism. Atari had originally developed games in-house. In 1979, 4 Atari programmers who had created some of the company's best-selling titles, David Crane, Larry Kaplan, Alan Miller and Bob Whitehead, left Atari after being denied credit and royalties for their work and founded Activision, the first independent third-party game publisher. Atari sued. The courts ruled against Atari. Activision was legally permitted to publish games for the 2600 without Atari's approval or licensing fees. The ruling opened the market to every third-party developer who wanted to enter it. By 1982, over 100 companies were publishing games for the Atari 2600. A Goldman Sachs analyst in 1983 noted that demand for video games had increased 100% year on year, but manufacturing output had increased 175%. The surplus was structural and growing. For consumers in 1981 and 1982, the abundance felt like choice. Hundreds of games on store shelves, new titles every week, prices dropping as competition increased. What it actually represented was an industry that had lost the ability to distinguish between what was worth making and what could be quickly produced and sold before anyone noticed how bad it was. The warning signs were visible to anyone paying attention. Atari CEO Raymond Kasser acknowledged in 1982 that the industry's saturation point was imminent. Nobody acted on it. Then Christmas 1982 arrived, and the 2 games that would define the crash launched within weeks of each other. E.T. and Pac-Man are the 2 games most commonly blamed for the crash. That framing is wrong, but understanding why it's wrong requires understanding what they actually were. Pac-Man for the Atari 2600 launched on April 3, 1982, a date Atari marked as Atari National Pac-Man Day, with promotional events across the United States. Atari manufactured more Pac-Man cartridges than there were Atari 2600 consoles in existence, anticipating that the arcade game's enormous popularity would translate directly to home sales. By the end of 1982, over 7 million copies had been sold commercially, making it the best-selling game on the platform. But the port was universally criticized as a poor approximation of the arcade original. The maze layout was different. The Ghost had no distinct personalities. Their movements were essentially randomized rather than patterned as in the arcade. The color palette was limited. The audio was a poor approximation of the original distinctive sounds. Players who had paid to play Pac-Man in arcades bought the home version and felt deceived. The gap between expectation and reality, between what Atari had promised and what they had delivered, became the defining consumer experience of the era. E.T. the Extraterrestrial launched December 1982. Negotiations for the game rights had concluded in late July 1982, giving designer Howard Scott Warshaw just over 5 weeks to develop the game in time for the Christmas production schedule. The average development cycle for an Atari 2600 game at the time was 7 months to a year. Warshaw was given a fraction of that. Atari manufactured approximately 4 million E.T. cartridges. The game received immediate negative reviews and generated significant retail returns. Millions of unsold cartridges were ultimately buried in a landfill in Alamogordo, New Mexico, a fact confirmed by a physical excavation conducted in April 2014. The critical distinction, which most retellings of the crash miss, is that Pac-Man and E.T. were symptoms, not causes. Pac-Man sold 7 million copies. E.T. sold millions despite its poor reception. These were commercially significant products. The crash was not caused by 2 bad games failing. It was caused by what those games represented. An industry-wide pattern in which publishers consistently prioritize speed of production and volume of output over quality. Pac-Man and E.T. were simply the highest profile and most visible examples of a failure mode that had been operating across hundreds of titles for 2 years. When Atari reported $536 million in losses in 1983, it was not because 2 games had failed. It was because the entire production and distribution model had collapsed simultaneously. For players in Christmas 1982, the Pac-Man purchase was a turning point. Many had convinced parents or grandparents to buy the 2600 on the promise of bringing the arcade home. The Pac-Man port delivered something that felt like a broken promise. That broken trust, multiplied across millions of households, became the market signal that retailers and investors could not ignore. But Pac-Man and E.T. were operating within a system that had been building toward failure for 2 years. The real cause of the crash was structural, and it had 3 distinct mechanisms. The crash had 3 causes operating simultaneously. Remove any one of them, and the industry survives in a damaged but functional state. Together they were fatal. Cause 1. Market saturation. By 1982, over 10 different game consoles competed for shelf space simultaneously. The Atari 2600, the Atari 5200, the Mattel Int Television, the ColecoVision, the Magnavox Odyssey. Each had an incompatible game library. A game made for the Int Television would not play on the 2600. Consumers faced a choice with no clear answer: which platform to invest in. Many chose to wait rather than commit. Manufacturers, reading declining sales as temporary, continued producing hardware and software at full volume. The surplus grew. The 2600 specifically had reached natural market saturation. Nearly every household that wanted one already had one, and no compelling next-generation successor was ready to replace it. Cause 2. Quality collapse. The Activision ruling of 1979 had opened the market to any developer willing to enter it. By 1982, over 100 companies were publishing Atari 2600 games. The majority had no game development experience. Development cycles were cut to weeks. Games shipped with critical bugs. Titles that would have been rejected by a quality control process had no such barrier to release. The ratio of poor quality titles to good ones shifted decisively in 1982. Players who bought 5 games and found 3 of them nearly unplayable stopped buying games. Retailers who ordered inventory and received returns stopped restocking. The cycle reinforced itself within months. Cast 3, the home computer. Personal computers, the Apple II, the Commodore 64, the Atari 400 and 800 offered everything a game console offered, plus productivity tools, programming environments and expandable storage. The Commodore 64, in particular, was priced aggressively at $595 at launch, dropping to $300 by late 1983. It offered a machine that could run games, manage finances, and run word processing software. Parents facing a choice between a dedicated game console and a home computer that could also play games increasingly chose the computer. Industry revenue from home console software fell from $3.2 billion in 1982 to approximately $100 million by 1985. The home console market had effectively ceased to exist as a commercially viable space in North America. The three causes created a feedback loop with no natural exit point. Oversupply reduced prices. Reduced prices compressed margins. Compressed margins pushed publishers to reduce development investment. Reduced development investment produced worse games. Worse games reduced consumer trust. Reduced consumer trust reduced sales. Reduced sales accelerated oversupply as unsold inventory flooded the market. No single company could break the cycle from within. Every individual decision, produce more, cut costs, ship faster, was rational at the company level. The collective outcome was irrational at the industry level. For retailers, the decision to stop stocking games was straightforward. Floor space given to a product category generating returns rather than sales was floor space that could be used for toys, electronics, or anything else. By 1985, major retailers had eliminated or drastically reduced their games section. The physical infrastructure that distributed games to consumers had largely stopped functioning. Atari reported $536 million in losses in 1983. Warner Communications sold the company in 1984, splitting into two entities. The Consumer Electronics division was sold to Jack Tramiel, who had founded Commodore. The arcade division was sold separately. The industry was not dead, but nobody in North America was certain it could be revived. Then Nintendo arrived, with a toy robot and a plan nobody expected to work. Nintendo had watched the North American crash from Japan. The Famicom, launched in Japan on July 15, 1983, had sold 2.5 million units in Japan by the end of 1984. The crash was a North American phenomenon. Japanese consumer confidence in home gaming had not collapsed. Yamauchi saw an opportunity. Nintendo began negotiating North American distribution in 1984. Initial talks with Atari collapsed when Atari discovered that Coleco had demonstrated their Adam home computer using Nintendo's Donkey Kong, which Atari believed violated a prior agreement. Yamauchi walked away and decided to distribute in North America independently. The Nintendo Entertainment System launched in New York City on October 18, 1985 as a test market. Full North American rollout followed in 1986. Nintendo solved the consumer trust problem with two specific decisions. First, the Nintendo seal of quality. Every game released on the NES required Nintendo's approval and a licensed lookout chip embedded in the cartridge. Unlicensed games would not function on the hardware. This gave Nintendo direct control over software quality, preventing any publisher from repeating the Atari model of releasing whatever could be manufactured quickly. Second, ROB, the Robotic Operating Buddy, was a toy robot packaged with the NES that interacted with two specific games. ROB was designed as a retail strategy. Retailers who had stopped stocking game consoles would stock toy systems. By positioning the NES as a toy and robot set rather than a video game console, Nintendo bypassed the stigma that had closed retail channels to the entire category. By the end of 1986, approximately 1.85 million NES units had been sold in North America. Super Mario Bros., bundled with the system, had introduced a generation of new players to a game that delivered exactly what it promised. Nintendo's model directly addressed each of the three causes of the crash. Market saturation was avoided by establishing the NES as the only relevant platform. Competitors either failed to launch meaningfully or launched years later. Consumers' choice was simplified to one option. Quality collapse was structurally prevented by the lockout chip and licensing requirement. The Nintendo seal of quality wasn't marketing, it was a hardware enforcement mechanism. The home computer threat was addressed by pricing the NES at $89.99 for the basic set, significantly below the Commodore 64, while bundling software that demonstrated its entertainment value immediately. For players encountering Super Mario Bros. In 1985 and 1986, it felt like a different category of product from the games that had preceded it. Not because it was technically superior to every Atari game, but because it was exactly what it promised to be, and players had forgotten that was possible. By 1988, the North American video game market was generating $1.7 billion annually. The industry the crash had declared dead had been rebuilt in 3 years. From $3.2 billion to $100 million in 2 years. From a dead industry to $1.7 billion in 3 more. The crash of 1983 was not caused by 2 bad games. It was caused by an industry that had grown faster than its quality controls, that had mistaken a boom for a permanent state, and that had no mechanism to stop producing when the market stopped buying. E.T. and Pac-Man were the most visible failures, in a system that had been generating invisible failures for 2 years. The recovery happened because Nintendo understood what had actually broken and built a business model designed to prevent it from breaking again. The Nintendo seal of quality wasn't a logo, it was the solution to the problem that had nearly ended gaming. And every quality control system, every licensing requirement, every platform holder approval process that exists in gaming today traces its origin to a toy robot and a grey box on a retail shelf in New York City in October 1985. That's what the crash actually was.